China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. We've seen you in the market recently making significant corn purchases, and for that, we thank you. Exports are a very important part of the overall demand picture for U.S. corn, and the American farmer values the relationship we have built together with you, our largest corn buyers over many decades. I'm very sorry we're not able to meet in person for this event, but as I've been watching the coverage and statistics on the COVID-19 pandemic, I've seen encouraging news coming from the countries in attendance today, and I hope you continue swiftly and effectively on your path to recovery from and the ultimate defeat of this virus. It is my desire to travel to your countries as soon as it is safe to do so, and I look forward to seeing and meeting many of you when conditions allow for that to happen. Should the current trends continue, I envision Northeast Asia as one of the first regions I will visit when international travel resumes. I'm excited to get started with today's webinar, where we will cover the latest information on the 2019 and 2020 corn crop, as well as prospects for the 2020 and 2021 crop that is being planted right now. We're also going to talk about the current situation for ethanol in the U.S. and the impacts of COVID-19 affecting a major source of demand for our crop. Now, I don't want to take too much time and too much information from the presentations that you're about to see, but the 2020-2021 corn crop is off to a very good start. I look forward to hearing from John Greer and Travis Strasser. These are farmers from Nebraska and South Dakota who will tell us how things are looking at their farms. As of right now, corn planting is 32% of the planting pace ahead of the planting pace that we saw last year, and we are 6% ahead of the 5-year average for this time of the year. We are now 36% ahead of last year in terms of corn emerged. So this upcoming new crop is looking great, and we're preparing for a very big year for U.S. corn production. Regarding the ethanol market, I look forward to hearing Marty Ruikka's expert analysis. The ProExporter, as many of you know, is a leading firm in the agriculture industry that provides great information, statistics, and forecasts that help market participants make informed and intelligent decisions. He will no doubt show you the unprecedented collapse in demand faced by our ethanol industry and the devastating effects of COVID-19 on plant profitability and overall health of the industry. You've likely seen the effects on DDGS prices, which increased rapidly at the beginning of the pandemic, followed by a rapid decrease, which continues to create volatility and uncertainty in the market. Today, the U.S. economy is starting to open, and driving demand is starting to come back. And with that, we hope certainty and stability will return to our U.S. ethanol industry and to the products consumed and produced at our plants. I would like to close with a reminder that the U.S. grain and export system has been and will remain open for business. We have affordable feed grains readily available for export. U.S. corn and sorghum are attractively priced, with ethanol and DDGS becoming more stable and more readily available every day. And I encourage you to take advantage of the reliability of the United States as your trusted source of supply. Thank you for your business. Thank you for being here this evening, and please stay safe.
All right, thank you very much, Ryan, for those opening remarks. And again, I'll remind people who may have joined here late, the language buttons below, please select the Japanese button for Japanese, the German button for Taiwanese, the French button for Mandarin Chinese, and the Korean button for Korea, for Korean language. Next on our program, we are going to show you some videos from two farmers, as Ryan mentioned, that are going to talk about how the corn planting season has gone for them so far this year. These videos are probably a little bit over a week old now, but it'll give you a great introduction to how the U.S. corn planting has progressed so far. First, you will hear from Mr. John Greer, who is from Edgar, Nebraska. He sits on as a board director on the Nebraska Corn Board. He is a fourth generation to manage his family's farm and works with his daughter, who would be the fifth generation. He raises corn and soybeans under irrigation and operates a 90-head cow-calf operation as well. We also have Travis Strausser, who's the Secretary-Treasurer of the South Dakota Corn Growers Association, and raises soybeans, corn, and spring wheat on his farm in northeast South Dakota. So we'll go ahead and play those videos, and you'll get a chance to see firsthand how the corn planting season has started here in the U.S.
Greetings from Nebraska. I'm John Greer, a farmer from Edgar, and we are here to tell you about the 2020 corn crop. In spite of all the problems that we had last year with the excessive amount of moisture, we have been dry enough this year to plant the crop in a very timely manner. Even with the COVID-19 pandemic and the uncertainty about getting the inputs that we needed so we could plant the crop, things have gone very smoothly. The suppliers have stepped up and they've supplied us with all the chemicals, all the fertilizer, and all the seed that we need at the present time. We started planting this crop about harvest time of last year, trying to line up the hybrids that we needed and looking at the soil fertility and lining up the fertilizer that we needed to put on so that we could grow the 2020 crop. I'm here to assure you that we will have a crop this year in America, and it's off to a really good start. Planting progress has been good. Some states are a little slower than others because of some other issues they've had, maybe too much moisture, maybe not enough, but things are off to a good start. Now, as we go on, my daughter Sarah and I are going to take you on a virtual tour or a virtual tractor ride of the planting progress that we did on May 4th, which was our last day. So enjoy. Here is a picture of a seed in a depth of about 1.5 inches. Soil is really nice and mellow, working very well. A lot of moisture. Hopefully we'll get a very good stand here. Plants per acre, trying to get them in the ground about 1.5 inches deep. It's imperative that we cover each seed with the same amount of soil so that they all come up the same day. Putting on starter fertilizer at about 3 gallons per acre. Out of the tractor, we have auto steer, which means it will drive itself as we move through the field. We have a monitor that shows us various things. This is each row unit pointing with the bar graph. set. Here are some plants that are emerging. This was planted in corn in April. It's now the 10th of May, so it's coming up. See the even spacing between these plants. Very important that we get even spacing because that's why we are so it's so critical to have the same planting depth so that they all come up at the same time. Thank you for your past business, and we look forward to serving you as we raise the 2020 crop in the next marketing year.
Hello from sunny South Dakota. My name is Travis Strasser. Farm corn, soybeans, and a little bit of wheat. Today we are planting soybeans. We are approximately 90% finished planting corn and 30% on soybeans, and we're 100% done on our wheat, spring wheat. We've got excellent soil conditions this spring. Most of our crop that has been planted was done about a week ago. We got about 1.5 inches of rain, and that shut us down and below average temperatures as well. So we are just getting back at it again today. I would say corn is about 10% emerged. Everything looks pretty good, even though we did get some pretty cold frost temperatures. Slowed things down considerably. Most of our beans, well actually none of our beans had been emerged at this point in time. So they're all safe underground. Otherwise, yeah, things look pretty good. We're waiting on some saturated soil conditions in some fields, so we probably won't finish for another 2 weeks probably, just because that'll take that long for some of those fields to become fit again. Otherwise, yeah, everything is excellent condition, good sunshine, good growing weather coming up as well. Statewide, South Dakota, I believe, is around 50% planted on corn, and I think like upper 30s, upper 30% on soybeans. So yeah, we're actually well above average. I'm very thankful for for what Mother Nature gave us for playing conditions this year. So thank you. That's my update from Northeast South Dakota.
All right, very well. I'd like to thank again John Greer and Travis Strausser for taking the time to put those videos together during their busy planting season for all of you to see here this morning. Before I get into our next speaker, just want to note we will have a question and answer or a Q&A panel discussion session at the end. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to start entering questions in there during the presentations or during the Q&A session. Also, feel free to enter them in your local language. We have staff on hand who can translate the questions into English for us to ask the presenters here today to be able to answer your questions during the Q&A session. So with that, we will go to our next presenter. Please let me introduce Reece Cannady, who's the Manager of Global Trade for the U.S. Grain Council here in our Washington, D.C. headquartered office. Reece works on a lot of our trade servicing projects and programs globally, and is going to talk to us on the U.S. Grain Council's Corn Cargo Export Quality Report for the 2019-2020 corn crop. So go ahead, Reece.
Hello, everyone. My name is Reece Cannady. I'm the Manager of Global Trade for the U.S. Grains Council, Washington, D.C. office. I'm here to present the U.S. Grains Council's 9th annual Corn Export Cargo Quality Report. As you may know, we also do a harvest quality report where the samples are taken at point of first sale. But what we'll be going over today is the export cargo report, which is all of the samples are taken at the point of export. This is the Council's 9th year to produce this report. We have all of our historical reports on our website. So please feel free to log on to www.grains.org to take a look at our past reports and analyze some of the data. Many of you have seen this before, but I do want to be clear for all of those that may have not seen it. We divvy up our results by export catchment area. So looking at all these states here that are run tributary to the Pacific Northwest ports, and then looking at this region here, which runs tributary to the U.S. river system and out the Gulf, and then this region here, which tends to be exported on rail to our partner to the south in Mexico. We took 430 samples this year, so more than an ample sample size. We tested for the following quality factors. We tested for our grade factors, which we'll spend a lot of time on today, and that's test weight, broken corn and foreign material, or BCFM, total damage, and heat damage. We'll also talk about moisture. Today we'll also talk about chemical composition, looking at our protein content, starch content, and oil content, and then we'll wrap it off with a talk about mycotoxins. If you'd like to look at any of the data surrounding the physical factors, that's these factors here, feel free to go online and look at the report at your leisure. But for the sake of time today, I will avoid those topics. But again, feel free to look online if that's something that concerns you. When we look at our highlights for the year, we're looking at a lower test weight, I think as many have heard, a bit higher BCFM, a bit higher damage, and then a similar moisture level on export to what we normally see, which is that 14.5% moisture that buyers around the world are used to getting from the U.S. Protein is a bit lower this year, with starch content also suffering. Oil was about the same, around 4%. And then physical factors are strongly related to a lot of our grade factors. So the higher BCFM also is related to higher stress cracks. The lower test weight and lower 100 kernel weight certainly correlated, and then density as well correlated with 100 kernel weight and test weight. Mycotoxins, we test for those each and every year, but this one year we did add fumonisin. So this, due to feedback from our customers and our international markets, we learned that fumonisin is a big concern. So we wanted to be sure that we were able to check that for you. We had a good year for mycotoxins. I think, I speak for most of the market when I say we probably anticipated more in the report. So certainly happy to see some depressed mycotoxin levels, particularly when we look at vomitoxin or DAWN in a year when maybe that was a little more prevalent due to our growing conditions. Now I'm going to get into the grade factors and moisture. First, I want to just put up the US number 1 through number 5 grades, just to remind everyone of the minimums. When we look at US number 1, we're looking at a minimum 56 pounds per bushel. And then number 3, which some of our customers buy in the region, are at 52 pounds per bushel. And then when we look at total damage of 7% at number 3 corn, and then BCFM at 4% for number 3 corn. So if and only if every grade factor is met or is exceeded for number 3, will it be considered number 3 corn? And the same goes for number 2, number 1, or even 4 and 5. When we look at test weight, I know much of the grain that you will purchase will come from the Pacific Northwest catchment area. So I do want to kind of focus on the Pacific Northwest catchment area, and then also maybe even focus a bit on the Gulf, just to highlight some of the disparities between some of the growing conditions. This year we had some very difficult growing conditions in the Pacific Northwest area, which lent itself to lower test weight grain. I know some of you have seen some of that come to your ports, and certainly it's a concern this year more than it has in past years. If you look at our national average, we are lower, and a lot of that is due to the Pacific Northwest. But if you look at the Gulf catchment area, and even in our Southern Rail catchment area, that's number 1 corn. So we're still seeing number 1 test weights being exported out of the Gulf and the Southern Rail area, while we struggle to keep up in the Pacific Northwest. A lot of the lower test weight grain in this region means we will probably see less exports out of the Pacific Northwest, as domestic ethanol plants will likely buy a lot of the lower test weight grain at a small discount so that they can continue to operate. When we look at BCFM, again, growing conditions in the Pacific Northwest lent themselves to higher BCFM this year due to some of the higher moisture levels, which we'll look at in a minute, that they had to harvest the corn. Gulf, we're still here right at 3% BCFM, which is enough for number 2 grain. This 3.8% on grade out of the P&W, keep in mind, is still good enough for number 3. So for those of you that are buying number 3 corn from the P&W, do understand that we have seen average grades coming in at number 3 for BCFM and really fairly consistent fashion. Whole kernels, highly related to BCFM. You'll see less whole kernels in years where there's more BCFM. Again, Pacific Northwest really struggled this year due to some of their moisture content and a lot of the artificial drying that they had to endure, which created some cracking in the grain, which led itself to a more brittle grain during the handling process. Total damage. P&W really didn't see a whole lot of damage in their exports. A lot of the damage really has come out of the Gulf so far. So, as you move and sort of evaluate your options between Pacific Northwest and Gulf, which I know many of you have done so far, keep in mind that you may see a bit more damage coming out of the Gulf, whereas the P&W didn't have quite so much. And this damage, when we talk about it, this is germ damage. Damage to the integrity of the grain and the ability to extract an energy value from the grain. So we're not talking about BCFM here, but really focusing on germ damage. When we look at moisture, we have the average of a 14.5. That is what the U.S. contracts when it exports. We do send roughly a 14.5 around the world. Pacific Northwest was a bit higher, and Southern Rail was the highest. But I think on average, you can really count on U.S. grain to come and export at 14.5. Now, that doesn't sound like high moisture, but remember, we're dealing with the export report. Now, when we looked at our harvest report, moisture levels were much higher than this. So Pacific Northwest moisture levels were quite a bit higher at harvest. We even heard stories of people harvesting in the 30% moisture range. And with that, you have to take out 16% of that moisture or that water content for you to be able to merchandise it internationally. And that mechanical drying really does a number on the integrity of the grain and makes it quite a bit more brittle. Chemical composition. So I want to go through this fairly quickly. When we look at protein in a dry matter, protein we're looking at 8.3. That's, it's a bit low, but it's certainly not that low when we compare to a lot of years of sort of an 8.6 average in there. The 5-year average was an 8.4 due to one outlier here in 15-16, which was a great crop year for us. But just want to highlight, we kind of sit around an 8.6 level. So 8.3 really isn't that far off on percentage-wise. Starch, we saw a major drop in starch content from 15-16 to 16-17, but ever since then we've been fairly consistent, hovering right around 72%. The U.S. is probably not going to give up starch content anytime in the future. It is what a lot of the push in plant breeding innovation has been for higher starch and more extractable starch for ethanol plants and for dry grind starch extraction. Oil content coming in at 4%, which is a bit higher than average, but still nothing really out of the question. I think year over year, we don't see huge changes in content or in chemical composition. I think the biggest change we've ever seen was really back here in starch when we saw this big drop-off that stayed fairly consistent. Otherwise, things tend to float around a certain range. Now, again, I don't see the chemical composition of U.S. grain changing a lot. I think, the thing that might drive the change would be a removal of demand in certain industries and demand coming in other industries where they need other things other than starch. So I think that's really the only thing that would ever change the composition of U.S. grain in many ways, but I don't foresee that happening in the future. Talk about mycotoxins. Briefly, I want to just read this to you that the export cargo mycotoxin testing provides an assessment of the presence of aflatoxin, DON, and fumonisin in U.S. corn as it reaches export points early in the marketing year. We tested 431 export cargo samples for aflatoxin and 180 samples for DON and fumonisin. We report only the frequency of detected elevated levels of mycotoxins in export samples. Positive results are only if we are above the lower conformance level, which for aflatoxin is 5 parts per billion, and for DON and fumonisin is 0.5 parts per million. Now you may ask why we did 431 samples of aflatoxin and only 180 samples for DON and fumonisin. The big thing there is FGIS, or the Federal Grain Inspection Service, always tests for aflatoxin to verify that it's below 20 parts per billion on export. And then we actually, as the Grains Council, had to do the separate 180 samples, and it's simply an issue of cost. We felt that at 180 samples, it was sufficient data and a sufficient sample size to present the data to you all. Whereas with the 431 results, since we already have them from FGIS, we figured we would take advantage of that data and capabilities. So looking at key aflatoxin levels in diets, these come from the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. Aflatoxin levels begin to become of concern at 20 parts per billion in dairy animals specifically, just because it goes through into the milk and into human consumption. And so really, it's humans that are more sensitive than the animal themselves. But when we look at getting into animal sensitivity, you're looking at 100 parts per billion is really a big concern for breeding beef cattle, breeding swine, mature poultry. You can cause some serious damage to the animals. Finishing beef cattle is really not an issue. So a lot of feedlots don't really have big issues with aflatoxin in the United States or around the world. But when we look at this year, we had, as you know, our growth this year our growing conditions involved a lot of rain. Aflatoxin is something that is conducive to drought conditions. So we only found one sample above the 20 parts per billion, and that was the last sample that we took in the survey. So this year was really not of concern for aflatoxin. And also keep in mind, if you do buy U.S. origin, the Federal Grain Inspection Service does guarantee your shipment to be below 20 parts per billion aflatoxin. We look at our historical aflatoxin results. It really hasn't been a big issue other than maybe years here in 16-17 and 12-13. But again, 96.3% had no detectable levels of aflatoxin, with only one sample coming in above this 20 parts per billion, which is the area of concern. But again, be sure that you're testing your grain upon arrival. Always, when it comes to mycotoxins, be sure that you're testing at destination. There's a great nutritionist once told me, you get results on what you inspect and not what you expect. So even if there is documentation saying that you're below 20 parts per billion, you've got third-party tests, whatever that is, when it shows up to your facility, please be sure that you're doing your due diligence and testing for aflatoxin so as not to do any harm to your operation. Moving forward, I want to look at DON or vomitoxin levels. Lower conformance level 0.5 parts per million. These are the Food and Drug Administration advisory levels. Swine are particularly sensitive to DON. That's the name vomitoxin comes from swine's propensity to throw up if they have too much DON in their diet. And then also you have some issues with chickens and ruminating beef and dairy cattle. That's not in the growing stage. So one thing that's important to note is you'll see here that it's 50% of the diet or less. So at 5 parts per million, you can still feed swine, 30 and 40% of the diet with those levels. So if you do test something and it winds up being higher than maybe you expected, and you're wondering, whoa, how can I use this grain? How can I get rid of it? Keep in mind that you can always feed, higher levels of toxins just in smaller portions of the diet, and you can then sort of wane down your inventory and eventually kind of get out of a jam if that ever happens to you. Looking at vomitoxin, we had no detectable level, or we had no levels of DON over 5 parts per million. We did have 26.1% of our samples come in this, which is slightly higher than years past. Certainly we saw a higher incidence of DON this year, but nothing over that 5 parts per million, which is really when we start to get concerned for swine and other animals. So, despite a year that was probably, we should have seen more DON than past years, which we did, it really didn't get out of hand and it was managed fairly well. One thing of note is that mycotoxins do triple in DDGS production. So you definitely want to be careful if buying DDGS. You do want to be sure that you're testing, in whole grain. If you want to go past the testing, that's one thing. But in DDGS, because of the propensity for it to triple its mycotoxin content, it's absolutely crucial that you understand your mycotoxin content in the DDGs upon arrival. As well, you might even look into contracting vomitoxin specs, which I know many of you do, into your DDG contract. But again, even if you have these tests at origin, please run them again at destination so you know exactly what you have at the time of feeding. Looking historically, 16-17 was probably our toughest year. And then 19-20 is going to be our second toughest year. So again, a bigger incidence of DON, but nothing, it didn't get out of hand up in these 2 to 5 and greater than 5 levels. We managed to kind of keep it under control with a lot of the damage coming here in the 0.5 to 1.9 parts per million range. Looking at fumonisin, we don't really have anything to compare this to in the past, but it is, as it is our first year taking the data for you all. So keep in mind, we are listening. If you have things that you want us to test for or things you want us to look at, please be sure to reach out and give us feedback, because we do change these reports to tailor what the markets around the world need. When we look at fumonisin, a huge concern when it comes to equids and rabbits. There's a bit of a concern when it comes to swine and also some aquaculture. And then mainly we're looking at poultry being a bit of an issue, and then ruminants and some of the layer poultry, or not layer, sorry, the broiler poultry are a bit less sensitive to fumonisin levels. Fumonisin testing results this year, we only saw 6.7% register any level of fumonisin. And at that, it was everything was below 10 parts per million. So when we look at diets that would be affected, there's really, other than equids and rabbits and maybe some specialty animals, there's really no major feeding group that would be affected by any humanicin that is below 10 parts per million. Again, it does triple. So if you are looking at something in the 7 to 8 parts per million range and it triples into DDGs, then you may have some issues in your swine diets and your DDGs. But again, these are things you can put in your contract with your DDG provider, as well as test when it gets there to be sure you're feeding it appropriately and are taking the appropriate care for mycotoxins. So with that, I'll conclude. I just want to say that on average, U.S. exports are number one when it comes to test weight and total damage, but they are slightly above the maximum standard for number 2 for BCFM. So we're looking at a number 3 grade for BCFM. Stress cracks and whole kernels were higher and lower than the 5-year average, respectively. We didn't discuss that in great detail, but certainly go online if you want to look at the data there. We talked about how the samples were reflective of a growing season not conducive to aflatoxin, so no real aflatoxin problems this year. And we did have a slightly higher prevalence of DON, but do keep in mind that 100% of the samples were still lower than 5 parts per million, which is the FDA advisory level. Again, there are other components of this report. There's the U.S. corn export system. There's the survey and statistical analysis that we do. There are the methodology behind the testing analysis, and then also some historical data. All of this can be found online at our website. Again, that is www.grains.org. Please feel free to go online, look at old reports, read into this report, understand how we're collecting the data, understand the methodology behind it, because this really is about giving you transparency, consistency, and a benchmark that you can look at every year so you can understand what's coming your way out of the U.S. And I think this year with the U.S. Geared up to have an extremely big crop and some really lowered corn prices this year, this report may be as important as ever because the U.S. is geared up to have a large export year just due to the massive crop that's around the corner. With that, I want to say thank you. It's a wonderful privilege to be here and present in front of you all. I'm really looking forward to the question and answer session. I hope you all have some great questions because I'm ready for them and I can't wait to field them. So thank you very much.
All right, Reece, thank you very much, Reece Cannady, for that presentation on the U.S. Grain Council's Export Cargo Quality Report. As Reece mentioned, we will be answering questions during the Q&A session at the end. We have received a few questions. Feel free to type in your questions at the Q&A button below. Again, feel free to type them in your local language. We have U.S. Grain Council staff on hand who can translate them into English for us to ask to our presenters for the Q&A session here at the end. To keep moving on, our next speaker is Marty Ruikka, who is the president of the ProExporter Network. As Ryan LeGrand mentioned in his introductory remarks, ProExporter is a company that puts out lots of key reports and some great future models that I know the U.S. Grain Council looks at and uses, as well as many of the other corn organizations across the U.S. Marty Ruikka has presented several programs for the U.S. Grain Council, including several different Asian locations, so many of you may have heard Marty speak in the past. And I know his outlook and ProExporter's outlook, especially as we see what the COVID-19 situation has done with U.S. ethanol industry and how that's changing the outlook on current U.S. corn supply and demand situation. So here is Marty Ruikka with his U.S. corn outlook.
Good morning. My name is Marty Ruikka. I'm the president of the ProExporter Network, and I'm giving a presentation today on the U.S. corn outlook. I want to welcome you to the seminar. I know that's already been done, but give you my welcome as well. And thank you for your participation. We're going to be going over current crop, the new crop, some COVID-19 impacts, how that's affecting ethanol and the corn supply demand table in the U.S. We'll also look at a few charts from the PRX Blue Sky model, which is our 10-year forecast. So I have a few things about the long-term projection, but mostly this will be on the current outlook. We will also discuss the phase one trade deal with China. So to start with, the phase one trade deal is being measured both by the U.S. and by China. The values that were agreed to are based on the value of the agricultural commodities delivered to China. So the values calculated will include freight. The baseline year was 2017, and those are calendar years. So for 2020, we just have data on the first 3 months of the year. So this chart is showing how 2020 is starting first quarter with the 4 bars on the very right side of the chart. They're comparing first quarter 17, 18, 19, and then 20. If you straight line trend what the commitment would be by China to purchase, and they were going to do that evenly, then the first quarter is only about 50% of an average annual commitment. But since we had so much impact, not just in the US and China, but around the world from COVID-19 health issues, I think it's pretty good that we've already got half of the commitment made. So we'll be measuring this as we go forward. I think that everybody's interested in this subject. It doesn't appear like it's really affecting the supply-demand table in a very big way right now. World production, consumption, and stocks of total grains and oilseeds. We like to look at this chart to just reinforce the idea that the urbanizing world is having a lot more demand of total grains and oilseeds, and we have a pretty positive slope on this chart. Stocks are also starting to go up, so our ability to, the stocks are detailed in the black line. So the ability to handle problems is in pretty good shape right now too, with these higher stocks. You can see back ending with the 2012 crop year when the US had the big drought, that's when world stocks were kind of at their modern low point. Just concentrating on corn, here's a world corn supply demand table. And US stocks to use ratio or stocks to use calculation is in red, and then the world stocks to use is in black. Right now, those are at good levels, but we see if we have a normal crop, normal planting, and normal growing season in the U.S., we think the U.S. stocks will go up quite a bit, and that's reflected in that last little hitch up on the red line. World corn imports also has a very good trend. If you exclude the European Union and the former Soviet Union, Russia, the world corn imports trend is increasing at 2.9 million metric tons a year. That's a pretty big number. And that's the long-term growth trend. You can see by the bar charts that in the last decade it's been growing faster than that. But this is a long-term trend going back to 1990, where we're growing at 3 million metric tons a year. So that's the job of U.S. production, is to help feed that new demand that's coming in every year. The world corn supply demand from the latest USDA WASDE release shows that corn supply is in pretty good shape for this year. We have world stocks to use and U.S. stocks to use detailed on here again. And for 2021, we see ending stocks rising to 340 million metric tons, again, assuming that we have a normal crop. So now let's look at what's happening in this current crop year in the U.S. There were some concerns early on with the COVID economic shutdowns and lockdowns, how the food and feed business would be able to execute, and particularly grain transportation. We've had a few hiccups in the U.S., a few complications from COVID-19 disease outbreaks in the meatpacking industry. That's getting corrected right now. But with respect to our ability to transport grain and export grain, things have been going pretty good. You can see we have data on this chart for the 1920 crop year, marketing year that we're in right now. We have the data through March, and monthly exports of U.S. were increasing along their normal seasonal trend. And our forecast for the rest of the marketing year is detailed there in red. Right now in the U.S., we're in the middle of planting the crop. As of last week's crop progress report, it's mostly about planting progress still. 88% of the crop has been planted, the corn crop. That's a pretty good number. We're not having anywhere near the problems that we had last year getting the crop planted. So that's a really good sign. That's always the first part of having a nice big production number. This time of year, we don't know what the yield's going to be. Here's a chart of the U.S. corn yield and the trend. When we do our supply-demand tables and our outlook for new crop, it's all based on a trend yield. So the trend yield that we're expecting right now is 175.1 bushels per acre. That's a U.S. average. And if we get that crop, then we'll have a very good production and plenty of corn to export, and very good carryover stocks as well. Part of the reason for the increasing trend has been how much of the crop has advanced seeds. So the bar chart is an indication. You read the legend on the right side, and that's a percentage indication of how much of the total corn crop planted is using advanced seeds with at least 2 traits. So we call that stacked traits or stacked genes. And you can see that 80% of the U.S. corn crop now has stacked traits. So this brings us to the supply-demand table. On the right side, the last 2 columns are for crop year 1920, which is the current crop year that we're in the middle of marketing. So the production numbers are pretty good on that. Those aren't going to change, but we still have a few months to go for the industrial use, the feed use, and the export number. So some of the numbers could change for the current crop year, the 1920 year. Right now, we're expecting to have a carryout of 2.2 billion bushels, which would be roughly the same as last year's carryout. And that's a pretty good carryout number, given that we had a lot of trouble getting the crop planted last year. So even though there was trouble during the planting season, we still had a relatively good production number of 13.66 billion bushels. As we look forward to new crop, again, this is estimate on a trend yield, assuming that we have normal growing weather. The crop size would be 15.5 billion bushels, which would be a new record. And if the use comes out according to the plan detailed here, our carryout would get very big at 3.48 billion bushels. That'd be a very large carryout, one of the largest carryouts we've had in a long time. I'll talk more about the export numbers. I think we're going to be in a position to have a really big corn export program after we get the new crop harvested, assuming everything goes well during the growing season. You could imagine with a normal crop and a normal growing season, in getting a carryout that big, the forecasts are for corn price to be maybe a little bit lower. Excuse me. That's not good news for farmers, but for end users and export customers, that's pretty good news. The carryout to use ratio will increase to 24%, which is a number that we haven't experienced since the early 90s. The farm price, we see it, this is average farm price. We see that dropping maybe to like $3.25. For new crop, if we get this big crop harvested, then this bubble chart shows you how the crop will be moved around for feeding outside of the Corn Belt and also for exports. So the dark gray bubbles in the middle are the production area in the Corn Belt, and those are the number of bushels available to be exported from each of those states. The white circles are where that crop can go to. So the big white circle down south of New Orleans in the Gulf of Mexico, that's 1.143 billion bushels of corn to export out the Gulf. In the PNW, the expectation would be for 536 million bushels. And you can see all the other bubbles there noted. So this is where the crop gets grown, how much can move after, you know, the use inside the Corn Belt is accounted for, and how we expect the crop to be used. DDG production is also noted here in a bubble chart. I have a few bubble charts on distillers grains. We can go through that pretty quick. DDG production at the moment has been impacted by the reduction in motor gasoline use, and I'll be covering that. But for next year, for the new crop year, we expect DDG production to start to get back to normal levels. So these bubbles indicate where the DDG production occurs. It's mostly in the Corn Belt. This next bubble chart is the consumption of distillers grains, and you can see it's used in feeding operations all over the U.S. And then on this third bubble chart, this is a net export-import, similar to the corn net export-import. So the dark bubbles are the amount of distillers grains that can leave those states where it's produced after they've used their local distillers grains, and then all the places it can ship to around the U.S., including the export points. We have an expectation during the new crop year of shipping 2 million tons out to PNW and 2.9 million tons out of the Gulf. The numbers for the distillers grains, domestic use and foreign use, or the exports, are detailed here along with a 5-year forecast. This forecast is handy so you can understand what the dip in DDG production is because of the reduced gasoline use due to the COVID-19 economic lockdown. We see that for the current crop year, distillers grain production is going to be off a few million tons, and we have it slowly climbing back up to normal levels over the next couple of years. So even though the ethanol plants are running for a few weeks, we got down to maybe 50% capacity, but it was only for a few weeks of the year that we're running that low. So overall for the crop year, it's an important reduction, but it's not as big as you think it might be. Here is the U.S. exports of distillers grains by quarter, and it's noted on here the main destinations. So our big markets for distillers grains are Asia, Canada, and Mexico, and then all others are detailed on there as well. So this is the expectations that we have, in the current crop year, with slightly declining volumes. But again, once we get into new crop, I think those volumes will continue to go back up. So now let's talk about how COVID-19 has affected agriculture in the U.S. And the main issue we have is in the loss of U.S. motor gasoline consumption. So this chart, the gray bars are what the motor gasoline consumption has been in the U.S. We were using over 140 billion gallons a year. And in the current crop year, we see that dropping down to, 128 to 123 billion gallons. So it's a really, really big loss. 10% of our gasoline has ethanol in it. And so as that gasoline use has declined, the need for ethanol has greatly declined, and that caused a lot of ethanol plants to shut down temporarily, which also reduced the distiller's grain production. We see the climb out coming back and getting back to about normal over the next couple of years. It looks like a V-shaped recovery, but it's not a snapback in that with all the unemployment that has happened during the economic shutdown, it's going to take some time for that to come back. And also a lot of people have learned how to work from home during the economic shutdown. And also, it's not clear how long it's going to be before we can get back to activities where you're in large crowds. So that includes transportation, sporting events, church, large shopping retail facilities, and other entertainment venues. So in general, that's going to reduce gasoline use as people, find other things to do rather than being in those large group settings that they're used to being in. This is a pretty busy table. It's the ethanol fuel supply demand table that goes out 10 years with the PRX Blue Sky forecast. I wanted you to have all the detail in case you're interested in that. We don't have time during this presentation to go through all of this detail, but if you have questions about it, please feel free to get in touch with your country director, and they can forward your questions to us. Here's a chart of the EIA fuel ethanol production, and we get this information every week, and you can see how dramatic the drop-off has been. It really, fuel consumption, kind of fell off a cliff along with ethanol production. The Energy Information Administration at the Department of Energy, every month they issue a forecast that looks forward for a couple of years. So the red squares are the current EIA forecast on how ethanol production is going to come back. In the monthly outlook from the EIA, it's called a short-term energy outlook. We get a lot of information about motor gasoline consumption, crude oil price, the E10 utilization, how much fuel is disappearing. Some of the notes on here in orange, you can see that we have a PRX full COVID-19 impact. So under the 2020 column in the middle of the table, for MoGas consumption, that's motor gasoline consumption, the EIA was estimating that calendar year 2020 motor gasoline could decline to 127 billion gallons. PRX has some calculations that say it could go as low as 120 billion gallons. The number we have listed there is actually 119,790,000,000 gallons. So 119,790 in orange. That's still a pretty big difference, between the EIA and the PRX calculation. We'll be getting updates of this information every month. And really, since the economy's never been shut down like this, there is a wide range of estimates. We're pretty confident in the way we calculate this information, and we think that the EIA's reporting system is aware of the numbers we're using in our calculation, and their reporting just hasn't caught up. So we'll see. We think the EIA monthlies for June, July, and August are going to come down closer to this number that we have listed. Again, that's a busy and a complex table, but I wanted you to see how we track each of the monthly reports. And so you can see the estimates. Each row is a different monthly report. And you can kind of track how EIA, looks at this subject over time. So the pool-wide average fuel economy is just a calculation of how much ethanol is being used, and we're right up, to this, close to 10%, which has been, some people call it a 10% blend wall. We haven't really gone through that yet. We've been having almost 10% ethanol used in our whole fuel supply now for over a decade. And we continue to we think that that's going to continue for a long time. So ethanol is not just used in the U.S., but it's used all over the world. And the U.S. is a major exporter of ethanol. It's an important use of corn, the ethanol domestic use and the foreign use. This table details the U.S. fuel and industrial ethanol exports by destination. Now, it's important that you note industrial ethanol. And why is that important? Well, the pandemic has made hygiene very important, and not just, individually, for people using hand sanitizer, but all the cleaning that needs to be done to all the places we work and travel. So the use of industrial ethanol excuse me, the use of industrial ethanol we think is going to go up quite a bit in the near future, but it's really hard for us to pick a number. Korea has always been an important customer for U.S. ethanol for industrial use. And I expect that that's going to continue, and it's going to grow all around the world. So we'll have to watch these numbers over the next year to see how fuel use of ethanol proceeds, given that we're in this really low oil price environment. It's going to be difficult for ethanol to compete on a price standpoint. So ethanol as a fuel is going to need to compete on environmental benefits and engine performance benefits. But industrial alcohol, I think that there's a good market for increasing that, and we'll have to watch that carefully. So this chart comes also from the Blue Sky model, our 10-year outlook. In the U.S., almost all the corn is rotated with soybeans. So to understand what the producer is feeling, you need to look at the combination of corn and soybeans. So this is gross revenues minus cost. You can see the great wealth build that we had that ended in 2013. It also coincides with what we call the commodity super cycle. And for the 6 years since 2013, prices have been very low. And our expectation for corn price and for margins for the farmer is going to continue to be low for the next decade. The outlook for whole corn and distillers grain feed use, this is feed use within the U.S., is detailed here. It's interesting to note the two bottom stacks on the bar charts are whole corn on the bottom, and then in green, the middle stack is the corn equivalent fed. The top is the residual use. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about residual use in this presentation. But if you look at just the two bottom stacks of corn and distillers, you can see that it's pretty flat with respect to domestic use. Now the red line is the total amount of animal protein that's being produced by that relatively level corn and distillers grain use. So the production efficiency is going up much faster than the use. We do expect whole corn use to go up, but only very slightly for domestic meat production. And a lot of that domestic meat production growth that we'll have in the U.S. will be for the export market, because we pretty much have all the meat we can use already in the U.S. So all of this growth will be export. Here's another chart looking at U.S. corn fed with the distillers grain displacement calculated. So that's not the amount of distillers grains being used, but that's the distillers grains converted back into corn bushel equivalents. When a bushel of ethanol is made, you get 1/3 of it in ethanol, 1/3 of it in CO2, and 1/3 of it in distillers grains. So if you convert the distillers grains back into corn, you can see the corn that's displaced by distillers grains is the top stack of those charts in white. And then each of the rest of the bar charts are detailing the use by poultry, hogs, beef, and dairy. On the bottom part of the chart, we have a graph including our 10-year forecast of what the meat exports are probably going to look like. So in our corn export summary, we're looking at the combined export of corn as whole corn, as ethanol, and as meat and distillers grains. So when you look across all of that, we're thinking that we're going to add 1 billion bushels of value-added exports over the next 10 years. So that's a pretty good growth. That's a growth combined in trend line average of about 100 million bushels a year. Then to wrap up our global case, you know, the really big feature, you know, the pandemic is a mega trend, a black swan. There's lots of terms you can use to describe, you know, how dramatic the pandemic is. But on price, the commodity super cycle really had a lot more to do with, or had a bigger impact, price impact, than the pandemic is having. The commodity price super cycle was driven by urbanization. Urbanization in China was really important, and that's something we need to look at with respect to the pandemic. It's been reported that 55 million people in China have gone back to the rural areas from the cities. This happened a little bit in 2008-2009 financial crisis, but it's reversed and switched back really quickly, and China continued its urbanization process at a very quick clip for the last decade. And it's not just China, there's urbanization going on all over the world. So I think that the pandemic is going to slow urbanization down for a year or two, but it'll get back to normal probably within 2 years. Crude oil price is a really important part of agriculture. When we do a regression model of corn price, we use crude oil price as one of the explanatory variables, and I'll show you our calculations on the next slide. But the outlook for crude oil price is for a pretty low price. We have the PRX outlook is much lower than the Department of Energy's and the USDA's right now. But the Department of Energy reference price from the annual energy outlook that's in red in the middle there, that was from their once a year 10-year outlook that they publish and comes out every November. I expect that number will be much lower when they publish again this November. The USDA early reference case that they're using right now in the early release of the baseline is I can't explain why it's so high. I don't know why they have this view that oil price, and this even before the pandemic, you know, I just don't see how oil price can get back to $90 a barrel. A lot of people don't realize that Venezuela has the largest reserves of oil of any place in the world, and it's not being utilized at all today. There's a lot of new capacity that's just starting to come online in Brazil. So I think between the fracking revolution that's been developed in the U.S. and can be deployed many other places in the world, and the big reserves in Venezuela, I think it's very likely that we have low oil price for a long time, which as import customers, you know, that's very important to you because it will keep corn prices and other commodity prices low. Here is the regression model I mentioned for corn farm price. So the whole purpose of our blue sky model, our 10-year outlook, is to get to an average annual farm price that can be used for people to plan when we're building new assets, whether they're train loading elevator, a new processing facility, or some other plant. So our outlook is for the average farm price of corn to be, around $3.50, which is, a pretty low price. It's consistent with the last 5 years. I don't see anything going on in the production or the supply-demand tables that would have corn price go very high, except for, maybe just very short periods, if we had a big crop problem. Okay, so that concludes my remarks. Again, I want to thank you for participating in the seminar and listening to this presentation. This last slide details some information about our company, how you can look up a little bit more information about the ProExporter network, and about how you can contact me if you needed to. So I look forward to your questions, and I wish you well in the coming new year.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Marty Ruikka, for that presentation. I know Marty always has lots of information in his slides, but some great information and some great outlooks into not only how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting things here in the short-term situation, but as we see, how ethanol production and global oil prices have a lot to do with what we see happening in the supply and demand situation with U.S. corn or even globally corn prices. So with that, we'll start with our question and answer panel discussion here. I've asked, so we have both Marty Ruikka and Reece Cannady that will be able to answer your questions. I've asked Ryan LeGrand to stick around for the question and answer. I know there's at least one question I saw that I probably will send his way. And I've also asked all of our Asia directors, so Hamamoto-san and Aksu Kim, Brian Lomar, and Michael Liu to join us. We may have them help answering some questions as well. So if you have additional questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box below. But we've gotten several questions that have come in over the presentation here already. Some of them are similar, so I may combine them into one question rather than asking the same question over and over. But to get started, our first question, probably directed towards Reece, but I'll let anybody who would like to answer it. Regarding the quality of the 2019-2020 corn crop, I heard there is a lot of powder and the corn is fragile and it is affecting the production of feed. What do you think is the reason for this? Is it because of the late cropping or late harvest last year? Yield was good despite the delay, so probably it is due to short-term growth due to delay in planting. So can you explain this, and how do U.S. feed manufacturers deal with this corn quality? Go ahead, Reece.
Sure. Thanks, Kerry. That's a really great question. This year, this past year, we had a late planting, which caused a shorter growing season for a lot of our growers. So as colder weather approached toward the later end of the year, they had to get their corn out of the ground or keep it in for the remainder of the winter, like we saw in some of the northern states. So that causes farmers having to get into the field a bit earlier when they have a window, and they're harvesting grain that, this year we've seen levels that are higher than traditional years, and that requires quite a bit of artificial drying for the grain to be able to maintain itself in storage as it awaits to move through the export channel. So with that artificial drying, depending on the heat that is applied to the grain, and depending on the intensity of that heat, that can have some effects on the stress crack percentage in the grain. And that stress crack percentage does show a more brittle grain that then is more susceptible to breakage as it moves through the export system. So if you're hearing about more powder or fines it would be due to, again, a late planting last year that required them to harvest the corn at a higher moisture than they would have liked to in other years.
Okay, thanks, Reece. We may keep you on. I think the next question is probably aimed towards you as well. Question first, thanks for the Grain Council for sharing the quality information. According to Reece's report, the U.S. Gulf and catchment area is better in terms of quality as far as BCFM is concerned compared to the Pacific Northwest. What is the reason for this, and is this the same trend you see every year?
Sure, that's a good question. I think this year was certainly abnormal. As far as BCFM is concerned, I think we do traditionally see it to be a bit higher coming out of the PNW. It's not unusual for that to happen. However, this year was probably a bit more extreme due to some of the conditions and some of the wet conditions they had where they weren't able to harvest up in those northern states that do run tributary to the PNW. So it's an abnormal year, but yes, I think generally PNW does have a bit higher BCFM, but this year is a little bit extreme.
Okay, thanks, Reece. The next question I'm going to point towards Marty. The question is, I'd like to know the outlook for U.S. ethanol production, for example, policy in the next 2 to 3 years in response to the oil price fluctuations.
So our ethanol policy is fixed in law. We have something called the Renewable Fuel Standard. So it's not something that should change due to COVID or other economic conditions. However, we end up with some complexities. So with the set volume, the volume right now that's required to be used as a statutory number. And we had been using 140 billion gallons of gasoline, so it was easy to blend the statutory volumes into that amount of gasoline. If our overall motor gasoline number is lower and we still have to blend these high volumes of biofuel, it's going to get complicated on the execution side. Ever since the RFS was passed, there's always been a lot of legal battles in the courts over details of the administration of the policy. Those are ongoing today. There's still some fights over a subject called small refinery exemptions. And then we have another important event coming up in 2023. The statutory volumes for biofuel use in the U.S. run out, and it's up to the EPA to set the statutory volumes from 2023 forward. So, there's going to be a lot of talk about this, certainly during the presidential election cycle that we have. But even beyond that, the new administration is going to have to deal with changing the policy to a policy that's set by EPA rather than statutory volumes. For now, we don't see very much change in how much ethanol is used. So the domestic use should be fairly consistent, except for, the complexities of reduced total motor gasoline use because of all the unemployment that we have.
Okay, thank you, Marty. The next question I'll aim at Reece again. I'm going to combine I think maybe about 3 different questions here. Reece, you had mentioned one farmer had harvested corn around 30% moisture, and that kind of led to a couple different questions of what normal moisture levels are farmers harvesting corn? Do we see moisture level difference in different parts of the growing region, and even what does it cost for a farmer to take moisture from 30% down to a 15% level?
Sure. Okay. There's quite a bit to that question. So I'll start with the 30% corn at harvest. So we did, again, the shorter growing season meant they had to get into the field earlier. And that was an extreme example, and that was our maximum value that we did see at harvest. So just to clarify, that grain was obviously dried down to be able to store. As far as where farmers harvest, I think it depends on where you are. The further south you are, the lower moisture content you're probably able to achieve. Farmers want to harvest, at something that would be acceptable because there are costs associated with drying. So depending on natural gas prices, which is what is generally used for drying in the U.S., that cost varies obviously year over year. So I think there's an analysis. If they had an infinite growing period, they would analyze the cost between drying it in the field or drying it with natural gas and then merchandising it, or being able to sell it at a slightly higher moisture content to their local co-ops that would then be able to dry it for them. So there's a bit of an analysis there, but on average, I would say farmers are down in the south probably 17%, and then on a normal year up in the north, you can be a little bit higher just because again, shorter growing season up north, which is why P&W generally has a bit higher BCFM year over year. Up there, you might see something in the low 20s. So there's a 4 or 5% range that farmers like to harvest in the U.S.
Okay, thank you, Reece. The next question I'm going to aim at Ryan LeGrand here. Question on the passing of Hong Kong's national security law recently, and the U.S.-China dispute is growing. You believe that the phase one of the U.S.-China trade negotiation will be implemented as planned?
I think both sides are going to make a full faith effort to implement phase one. We really do believe that. We can see that the purchases from China are starting to ramp up. We've seen some good corn and sorghum sales. We're hoping to see some DDGS and ethanol sales going that way as well. And we think that both of those products should be pricing in the near future. I don't really want to touch on exactly the Hong Kong dispute here. That's not really our lane to get into, but here at the U.S. Grains Council, what we would like to see is a relationship moving forward based on mutual respect. I think that would be best for both sides. So we really hope that happens, because the entire world is in a better place when the China and U.S. trading relationship is on more normal grounds. We really do believe that. We appreciate our business with China, and we think that both sides again will make full faith effort to implement phase one.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Again, I'm going to combine a couple of questions together here. We've got a couple different questions regarding protein content in U.S. corn. So Reece, what was the reason for the lower protein content in the 16-17 crop? And then one question saying they recently imported some U.S. corn and crude protein was under 7% level. I'm guessing that might be as fed versus dry matter analysis there, but what is the reason you see for the crude protein differences?
Sure. So this year we saw it was an 8.3% average versus 16-17 we were at 8.6% average. So slightly lower. There's a few things that affect protein. Genetics is one of them. I don't think genetics played anything to do with it here. Another thing is weather and crop conditions, and then also available nitrogen. So when you look at a year like 2012, when we had a horrible drought, we had protein levels come in at 9.2%. And so a big reason for that is the available nitrogen was dispersed among lower yields, thus throwing a higher protein content into the grain. So lowering yields will generally throw a higher protein content. And then at the same time, having excess water and having maybe higher yields would then lower your protein content. So if you've got this past year, I think we're down just by 0.3%. I think that's fairly within the range of normality, which is 8.4%, or I believe 8.5 on the 5-year average. So we're not that far off. But if I were to attribute it to anything, I would probably say the excess rain was the abnormal thing, the outlier here that would have pushed it down. I don't see anything else. Yields weren't too terribly high this year to be able to push it down significantly. So again, I think it really just has to do with rain. Now, regarding the 7% versus the 8.3% that we were seeing, I agree with you, Carrie. I think it is as-fed analysis versus dry matter. So when we do our analysis, it's a dry matter analysis. We take out the moisture content when we analyze it. So we're basically just analyzing the percentage as a percent of everything but the water. So when you're looking at grain as fed, you're analyzing the water as well, and that water does not have any protein content in it, which would then lower the percentage of protein in the grain itself via that analysis method.
Okay. Thanks, Reece. The next question I think I'll pose to Marty here, talking about obviously COVID-19 being a very important issue globally and what it's doing to overall grain and animal protein demand. But with COVID-19 still ongoing in the U.S., how is it impacting the demand and price variation in the U.S. meat market, especially pork?
So our meat producers, the meat packers, the people who take the live animals, slaughter the animals, cut up the carcasses, and get the meat ready for market, those plants have had a lot of COVID-19 outbreaks, and the way the workers are deployed in those plants, in sections of the plant, they work very close together. So those outbreaks became a problem. We lost, some estimates are that we lost 40% of our meat packing capacity in pork, and a slightly smaller number, maybe 30% or so in beef. So plants actually had to shut down for a time. The president used his authority to require those plants to operate, and so there's been a very significant effort to come up with better sanitation, and it's I guess you would call it social distancing or isolation. Putting up plexiglass screens in between the workers on the meat cutting line and things like that. So plant capacity is coming back up right now. When those plants went offline, we had a lot of animals that were ready to harvest, and so we've seen a lot of price fluctuations throughout the value chain. So there's been price impacts to the consumer, and some meat shortages, but it's not like people were going hungry because of that. There was still overall plenty of meat available in the U.S., but some people's preferred cuts or the accessibility to that meat was curtailed for a time. I think that's all improving now. Distillers grains is a little bit unique too. You saw the bubble chart I put up that shows how distillers grains is fed in almost every state in a pretty large volume. So feeders have gotten used to having distillers grains as part of their feed ration. And when our ethanol plants went down in mid-April, we lost about 50% of the ethanol production capacity. So there was a really quick shock to distillers grains availability in the short term. And people who were used to feeding it were willing to pay a lot of extra money to get access to the distillers grains, so they didn't have to change their ration or their formula. I think that will stabilize. People are at first, you just let price do the rationing. And then people start to look at, well, what's a better way? Can I grind some corn? Can I use some soybean meal? So everybody's been making some adjustments. So these aren't like permanent price structure changes. These are just the market doing its job to adjust to the quick nature of we call it the shutdown shock. I think that distillers grains' normal relationship to corn price will return, probably within 6 months. It'll be normalized, and if the distillers grains production isn't back all the way to where our feeders want it to be, then they'll make adjustments by grinding whole corn and using meal. So they'll make kind of a semi-permanent change to their ration. So we're seeing, for some people prices are going up, for some people prices are going down. Some people have seen a full sine wave in their prices. So every price scenario you can imagine has happened to each of these different market sectors, and price is very impacted quite differently all throughout an individual supply chain.
Okay, thanks, Marty. The next question, I'm going to combine, again, 2 questions into one here for Ryan LeGrand. Reece maybe have some comments here as well. But question is, how can the U.S. guarantee inland transportation and port loading without interruption due to COVID-19? And kind of in line with that, how will U.S. declare force majeure for grain export program if COVID-19 becomes worse, and which authority can declare force majeure?
Okay, I'll take the first part of that, and Reece, maybe you want to take the second part. We've been in touch with our members who have export facilities, other members who are in charge of inspection and testing at the ports. We've been in touch with our container loaders and with those that are loading rail cars of corn and DDGS to go to Canada and to Mexico, as well as ethanol. And the loading of a lot of these products is highly automated. So it's not like you don't need a large group of people in one room or one area to load a vessel or to load a rail car. You can achieve appropriate social distancing. And, we've seen that. We've seen that the U.S. has been able to maintain our export channels open. We've also been in touch with the Waterways Council, and the Waterways Council is an association that advocates for the improvement of our inland waterways. As you may know, we have a lot of rivers where we ship barges down to the Gulf, and there's, I think, 19,000 kilometers of inland waterways, and they've really had no problems from COVID-19. They've had a few, they've had a number of cases, but none of them that would put them offline and cause them to stop operations. And we've seen that day in and day out. The flow just hasn't stopped. So due to COVID-19, really it's tough to absolutely guarantee it, but the high automation of these loading processes allow them to continue operations without many problems.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Do you want to have the other part, Reece?
Yeah, sure. I just want to clarify. The question was, does the U.S. plan to declare force majeure, and who can declare force majeure? Those were the two?
Correct.
So I'll just answer probably the second one, since that would answer the first. The people who would declare force majeure would be the sellers, or the people who are stopped from or unable to perform on a contract due to an act of God. I have a few comments on force majeure. The first comment is, we don't often see force majeure declared out of the U.S. or really anywhere for that matter around the world. It's always best to resolve disputes or any kind of, or figure out a way to resolve any kind of contract dispute rather than declaring force majeure. And I think, in talking with U.S. providers, there's a high likelihood that they are willing to negotiate some sort of a way out if something like this were to ever happen. Now, I don't think it's going to happen. I think companies recognize that financial hardship or anything like that does not allow you to declare force majeure. So I don't, barring a major hiccup in shipping or anything like that, which Ryan mentioned, it's tough to guarantee, but we likely will not see that. I don't foresee a lot of force majeure declarations. We've heard of a few, but I don't foresee it becoming a pattern, since I think the market was fairly certain that may be tough to justify at that time. So it's possible sellers could declare it, but I don't foresee it being an issue. And again, if it does come up, I'll always look to negotiate some sort of a mutual agreement so as to maintain relationships. It's very important in the U.S. for us to maintain relationships, and so that's always going to be an option, I think, for U.S. sellers.
Okay, thanks, Reece. The next question, I'm going to aim at Marty here. This is actually coming from an ethanol buyer. Are corn supply contract terms of corn producer and ethanol plants the same with the slowdown in ethanol production due to the pandemic? Is that the same, or is that changed? Is it mainly spot price buying, or how is that working today?
So ethanol plants have a variety of ways of procuring corn. Some ethanol plants prefer to buy a lot of their corn directly from producers. Some want to buy it from commercial entities, and then there's mixed. Some ethanol plants stay always in the spot market because of their risk management policies that they've established. And some ethanol plants are a lot more aggressive about price risk management, and particularly, about trying to fix their corn price forward. So, there is no single answer because there's so many different ways that people procure. We've there was some talk in April about for people for ethanol plants who had a lot of forward contracts with producers. I do not know if they actually executed, went all the way, to canceling those contracts due to force majeure, if they, worked something out. But it was a really complicated situation, to shut down, a lot of our refining capacity and a lot of our ethanol plant capacity, in an unplanned way, was messy. So anecdotally, you could, any situation you could imagine, I'm sure there's at least an anecdote of that happening. In general, I think things have worked out pretty good, with the exception of the producer. The farmer who had bushels to sell, he saw prices go quite low for corn, and that's really had a negative impact on the producer. I would say that's the biggest impact overall in the ethanol space, is that the price expectation that the producer had has been negatively impacted in a great way by the pandemic.
Okay, thanks, Marty. The next question, either Marty or Reece can answer, although Reece needs to slow his speech down a bit for the translators. And so the question was, U.S. planting was forecasted for 97 million acres of corn. That's what was in the latest WASDE report released back with May 11th. Now with U.S. planting underway, do we see there a possibility of any non-planting being done, switching to soybeans? or do you see us hitting the 97 million acre mark?
I'll start. The WASDE reports, they take the March planting intentions number and they maintain that until we get the June planted acres number. So for another 5 or 5 weeks, let's say, the March planting intentions number is the official number, acreage number. Now, there's been enough price action between corn and soybeans since the March number was published at 97 million acres that there's been some switching. I think that there's a good chance that number will go down from 97 million acres, but there's a pretty decent range of estimates over how much that's going down. I don't have a strong opinion as to how much it's going to go down.
Okay. We're getting close to our time limit here, but I'm going to go ahead and ask one more question, although I have lots of questions here to pick from. And so this question is, no, I lost it here. With corn demand decreasing due to the slowdown in ethanol, how is that affecting corn price for feed use in the U.S.? How is DDGS production decrease impacting livestock operations and their use of DDGS in the U.S.?
So I talked a little bit about that all feeders are having to adjust to DDGS being higher priced and limited availability in some areas. So the quick ways to replace DDGS, if you've been using DDGS and you lose your access to that, you're going to probably use some soybean meal. And the soybean crush in the U.S. has gone up for the last few years, so there's plenty of meal available. And you will also grind some whole corn. There's two different ways that whole corn is ground for feeding, two primary ways in the U.S. So that will be the replacement. Price of corn, has price of corn does not affect just one segment of the market. Usually any segment of the market that changes their use will have an effect on price, and that price changes for everybody in the market. Because the U.S. trade, even though there's basis differences, geographical differences, everybody trades the basic price structure. So with reduced demand by ethanol and in general lower corn prices, all other end users of corn have slightly lower cost of corn or cost of feedstocks.
Okay. Well, thank you, Marty. I think we're even just past it would be 12 or noon in Japan and South Korea, and 11 a.m. in China and Taiwan, and it's 11 p.m. here for us, most of us here in the U.S. So we have some unanswered questions yet, but we'll work to get those answers to you. And feel free to reach out to our offices across Asia. So reach out to Hamamoto-san in Japan, or Haksu Kim in South Korea, Michael Liu in Taiwan, or reach out to Brian Lomar or Yan Tianxing in our Beijing office. If your question didn't get answered, we can work with them, and we'll make sure to get your answers to those questions. Or if you're looking for additional information, please always feel free to reach out to the U.S. Grain Council's offices in the countries where you're located. But with that, I'd like to thank our speakers today. Marty Ruikka, from ProExporter, Reece Cannady from U.S. Grain Council, and even Ryan LeGrand for making his opening remarks and staying around to answer some of the maybe a little more difficult questions that I pointed towards him. So again, appreciate everybody for taking part in this morning's program, and appreciate your past and future business of U.S. feed grains in all forms. So thank you very much, and that'll end our webinar for this morning.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Appreciate.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Good day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Reece and Marty.
Yeah, you're welcome. Ciao.
Yep.